many of you use Wi-Fi? How many of you has ever cursed at your Wi-Fi? That's good, it's not just me. So I'm going to give you some idea of some of the reasons why you may want to do that in this talk. How many of you are going to leave if I show you code and maths on the slide? How many of you are going to leave if I don't show you code and maths on the slide? You're in luck. So, buffer bloat. Has any of you heard of buffer bloat before? That's not too bad. So buffer bloat, this is basically buffer bloat. Buffer bloat is what happens when you load up your link, whatever it is, and you go from down here. This is the first 5 seconds. This is just a ping flow. So 5 seconds in, we start up some TCP transfers in the same link, and you can see suddenly the latency climbs from the 10 milliseconds that the link has up to about 1.2 seconds. And this is due to queuing of buffers on the link that fill up, and all the ping packets have to go through there, and you will get a lot of extra latency. So this is from an experiment I did evaluating different solutions for this a few years ago. And what we did to fix it was this. We applied the queue management scheme called FQCuddle, where you can see now instead of going from 50 milliseconds to 1200, we go from 50 to 51.5 milliseconds. And these are also the TCP flows. They're a lot more stable. So this is what you do on a wired link. We have this. It's a combined scheduling, packet scheduling, and active queue management algorithm that you install in the link, and it will make sure that you don't see this extra latency. So this was a while ago that this goes, and this is I'm just going to go through, give you a quick history of what has been happening in fixing buffer bloat in Linux in general, and then I'll go on and talk about Wi-Fi. So the first fix that went in is this thing called byte queue limits, which went into Linux in Linux 3.3. What that does is it tries to make sure that you don't have too many packets queued up in the driver when you send out traffic, so that you can actually keep them where you can control them. Then the FQCuddle queue management algorithm that I just mentioned went in Linux 3.5, and it became the default in OpenWrt LEAD around April 2013, as I think OpenWrt was the first distro to actually make it the default, thanks to Felix, who was brave enough to do that. And it's worked really well. So the second graph I showed you is actually what you will get on OpenWrt today. Another thing that is in Linux is a thing called TCP small queues, which tries to keep the TCP stack from dumping too much data into the driver and into the socket at one time. I haven't put an OpenWrt lead on this because it's not too relevant for routers. It's mostly something you have on your host stack, where you have the TCP flows. Then we have the FQM scripts package, which is in OpenWrt lead, and this will configure queue management for you. There's a GUI for it, and you can add a traffic shaper so that you can take control of your queue if it's your modem that is bloated and so on. Then there's a thing called packet pacing, which is tied to another queue diff called ShedFQ, which went in Linux 3.12. So this is also a thing you will do in the host, where instead of dumping a whole window of packets into the network device at once, you will try to pace them out over the time of the round trip time, so you get a much smoother traffic going through. The Cake QDisk is an experimental development on top of FQCuddle, which went into mainline OpenWrt lead in May, where we tried to take basically some of the things that we have in SQM scripts with different tiers of of shaping and so on, and we try to put them into one QDISC, so you just turn it on and it works. It's still under development, but it's working quite well. And then finally, just a few weeks ago, Google finally released their BBR congestion control algorithm, which is scheduled to go into Linux 4.9. So this is a hybrid model-based congestion control algorithm that tries to not build queues in the first place. And so if this works really well, we don't actually need any of the other stuff. But fortunately, the internet is very diverse, so you will still get places where you still get a win from having proper queue management on your device. So these are sort of the historical fixes that have gone into Linux. We've come a long way with the buffer bloat management in Linux. But as we've seen, there are still some problems with Wi-Fi, as many of you experienced. And I'm going to talk about the two main problems that we've been looking at here. One is just the buffer bloat in Wi-Fi, excess queuing latency, and the other is the thing called airtime fairness, where if you have both slow and fast stations in the same network, then as Wi-Fi is by default, everything will run at the slowest speed, which is not necessarily a good thing. So the first thing is buffer bloat in Wi-Fi. This is to give you a sense of what we've been able to do. So this over here is the, on the right-hand side, is the current default kernel running on the on Ath9K, where when you load up the link and send out packets, note the logarithmic scale here, you will get around 300-400 milliseconds of delay. So this is just from running simple TCP traffic that saturates the link, and then measuring the latency you will get. Whereas with the modifications I'm going to talk about in a few seconds, we get this down to about 20 or 30 milliseconds under full load on a Wi-Fi link. The other thing is this thing called airtime fairness. So this is just a very simple model of what happens in terms of when you transmit data over a Wi-Fi link. And it's actually just TI here is the timeshare that each station gets, and rate is the rate that you get with that each station gets. And this just says if you have airtime fairness. So airtime fairness is just saying each station gets its fair share. Everyone gets the same amount of time to transmit packets in the network. So by assumption, this is just 1 over the number of stations. However, this is the problem that we see in the 802.11 protocol. So the 802.11 protocol is designed so that everyone gets the same opportunity to transmit data. So that means it doesn't matter how long they spent transmitting this data. So if one station is transmitting at 1 megabit per second and another is transmitting at 10 megabits per second, that first station is going to spend 10 times as long transmitting one packet as the other station is. So this just says that the ratio of time that each station gets is the time it takes that station to transmit one packet or one aggregate divided by the total time that all stations take to transmit one aggregate. So if this varies a lot, you can get the time is going to be a lot different. And then the rate is just the rate that one station would get if nothing else was there, divided by the percentage of time it can actually transmit. And to turn this into something concrete, this is what happens. So this is a graph of the actual time spent transmitting with 3 stations, where the big purple one is the slow station. So this transmits at the lowest rate, and the others are just sort of normal 50 megabit per second through rate on an 802.11n. So what you see here, this is the left-hand side is what you see today, where one station will grab almost all the airtime, and then the 2 fast stations are left to fight over the scraps, so to speak. Whereas on the right-hand side here, you can see developed a scheduler that will actually enforce fairness between the stations, and as you can see, this works really well. Everything gets a third of the available airtime. I'll come back to what this means in terms of throughput and so on a bit later. So, what have we done to make Wi-Fi great again? We've done two things, basically. We have restructured the queuing structure in the Linux kernel for Wi-Fi stations. Can you see this at the back? Probably not, right? No. Okay. Well, at the top here, on the left-hand side, is how the Linux kernel queuing structure looks today. The top-hand side here is the queue disk layer, where you can have a big queue, and then the MAC 8211 layer does not do any queuing, so we go all the way down to the driver. And in the driver, you will have a queue per transfer ID of up to 123 packets. So that means up here in the queue disk layer, which is where you can install all the advanced queue management algorithms, then you will still have a lot of queuing beneath, and that is what adds all the latency that you saw. And of course, the default in Linux is also just having a big, dumb FIFO 1,000 packet queue. So what we did was we changed it to this here on the right-hand side, where you can see this up here is now the queue disk layer, which is completely empty. So we completely bypass the queue disk layer now on Wi-Fi with these modifications, and instead we move all the queues into the MAC layer. So you do actually need to have queues per station, because otherwise you can't do aggregation. So what we did is we split up packets when they enter the MAC 8211 layer, and then we queue them per transfer ID, which is basically QoS plus stations. And then for each of these, we apply the FQ-Codel queue management algorithm. So this means that now in the driver, which is this part here at the bottom, we only have the retry queue. We don't actually have any persistent queue in the driver in most cases. We only have down here a single or two aggregates queued up to ready to go to the hardware. So this means that all the smart queue management algorithms we can do, all the latency reducing stuff, is now much closer to the hardware, and it's also per station. So that means a lot of the optimizations you get can now be applied per station. And that is what you saw in the beginning, why we get the big latency reduction. The second thing we did is a scheduler-based approach to enforce airtime fairness. This is F9K only at the moment. So this is, of course, it's a bit of a simplified version of it, but basically what we do is on the left-hand side here, you can see we measure on every transmission, on every time we receive a packet. We figure out which station did it come from or is it going to, and then we just calculate in the station we have a deficit of how much time have you spent transmitting, and we just account the duration of the packet to that station every time we get a packet. And then over here on the right-hand side, we have the scheduler, which is what decides which station gets to go next. And this is it's simplified a lot on the slide to make it fit on here, but it's based on FQ-Codel, so it's basically a round-robin scheduler where this is called, as long as the hardware queue has space, we try to find the first station, that is this part, that has a deficit that's positive. If it doesn't have a positive deficit, it goes to the back of the round-robin queue and gets a deficit increased by a little bit. So this is the round-robin scheduler that tries to find the first station which is allowed to transmit. And then if the station has anything to transmit at this point, we will queue an aggregate to that station. It's a very simple mechanism, but it enforces airtime fairness as you saw before. And so what do we get from this? Well, we get now, instead of everyone getting the same throughput, everyone gets the same airtime. So that means that now your achieved throughput on in the air only depends on yourself. It doesn't depend on whether or not you're competing with slow stations. And this is what that means. Over here we have the on the left-hand side diagram is the airtime share for the three stations, which it's the same you saw before, where the first two columns is no modifications. You get a lot of airtime to the slow station and a lot less to the others. And then on the right-hand side of the graph on the left, you see when we apply its unfairness, we actually get a fair share. So on but the interesting part here is actually on the right-hand side of that graph. You can see what happens with the throughput. So the first 3 columns are the 3 stations, and then on the right you can see the average. And if you look at the average first, you can see that the average throughput, that means also the total throughput for the network, goes up by about a factor of 2 or 3 in this case. I think this is a simple TCP, one TCP transfer to each of the stations. And of course, this is because the fast stations now go a lot faster, and the slow one goes a little bit slower because it doesn't get to grab all of the airtime. But in terms of efficiency of the whole network, this translates to a total throughput increase of quite a lot. We've also tested it with 30 stations instead of just 3. And then on the left side, you can see up here the slow station is also grabbing 60–70% of all the airtime, even though it's competing with 29 other stations. But we can actually control that with the scheduler and get it down to a fair share. And of course, when there's that many stations that suddenly go a bit faster, then you get the total throughput on the right-hand side graph there now increases by a factor of 5. Right. So another thing we did when we created this airtime fairness scheduler is we put in an optimization. That means that if you have a station that only transmits occasionally, like if it's, and occasionally is a very short time scale. So for example, if you have something that just has a VoIP flow, or something that usually doesn't require a lot of bandwidth, but it's usually latency sensitive. There's a lot of things, it's like the first TCP packet you send out, DNS lookup, all these sorts of small things that you really want to get priority and get out there quickly because they impact the latency of your whole session quite a lot. And FQCoddle has this innovation in it where it will give temporary priority to these sparse flows. And we translated that into stations as well. So if a station hasn't transmitted for a while and suddenly it has one packet to transmit, it will actually go to the front of the round-robin queue instead of to the back. And you can see it best on the slide on the graph on the right, which is from the 30-station test, where you actually go the solid line is with the optimization enabled. We can actually improve the latency to a station that only has sparse traffic by about a factor of 2. And of course, on the left-hand graph, you can see it doesn't give quite as much benefit when there's only 3 stations, but we do get a little bit fairly consistent, like between the 2 pairs of lines in that graph. You can see there's a consistent improvement. So this is sort of just a way of transferring the same sort of micro optimization, and it's nice because you don't have to configure which station is the one that you get priority. It just happens automatically if a station doesn't transmit as much, and that is nice if you, for example, have your handset that only has a VoIP traffic call while you're downloading on your laptop, for example. So that was an overview of what we've achieved with this work. Of course, it's I get to present it, but there's a lot of other people, some of whom are in the room, who've been contributing to that, and I'd like to thank them as well, of course. There's still some things, so this work is just about to go upstream. Some of it will be in 4.9, but for the Ath9K driver, it will be in 4.10 in Linux, and it's already been, Felix has already pulled it into lead. So it is in the trunk of lead right now and will be in the upcoming release, at least the queuing rework. But going forward, of course, this is mainly based on Ath9K, as most things tend to be in the early development phases. The MT76 driver will benefit from parts of this as well. The Ath10K will benefit from parts of it as well, depending on your hardware. And then, of course, we still need to go and look at a lot of the other drivers and see how we can make them use this. So the restructure in Mac 802.11, the driver has to explicitly say, I want to do this, because it changes the transmit paths when you use this. The second point, we've had some issues with scaling throttle. So in a Wi-Fi network, two stations can have very different rates, and they can vary quite a lot over several orders of magnitude within less than a second. And so the throttle atrium part of the algorithm, in some cases, can scale badly in this case. And it's not something that's going to hurt performance that much, but if you can see it in some of the data, and we're working on ways to try to make that scale and not impact it as much. We also have some ideas of looking at the sizing of aggregates. So for example, if you have a lot of stations, you may want to sacrifice a bit of efficiency by scaling down the size of your aggregate to gain latency. And being smarter about this is something we want to look into. There's also this airtime share policy, was an idea someone came up with when we started talking about this. We have now a scheduler that will enforce a certain airtime usage between stations. So can we actually use this to express policy? For example, you have a guest network, and you say, I don't want my guest network to take up more than 20% of the bandwidth. Well, maybe you actually mean, because airtime is sort of the scarce resource here. So maybe what you mean is, I don't want the guest network to use up more than 20% of the time. And can we actually express this in a way that works and have the scheduler modify its behavior so we can enforce these kinds of prefixes? So you just have a configuration and say guest network 20%, and then it will do its thing, and you won't feel that you have guests. Then there's mesh networks. So the scheduler now, it started out being focused on the AP case. So it works inside the driver, and that means it divides out airtime between the stations that the driver can see. This also works in a mesh, but each station sort of does its own thing. So maybe you would want some kind of distributed algorithm in a mesh to actually have complete fairness over the whole mesh network. This is a hard problem, and I don't know what we can do about this, but it's one of the things that we've been talking about that may be building on this work. There's also the rate selection algorithm, Minstrel, in the kernel. There's some work called Minstrel Blues that tries to use Minstrel to scale down and also scale the TX power, so that you don't necessarily, if you have two devices right next to each other, you don't necessarily want to shout at the full power for each of them, because then you're going to disturb everyone else. So you can use Minstrel to also scale down dynamically the power, and you can get a lot denser deployments of wireless. So the guy working on this has some very, very nice results on this, but it has not been upstreamed yet. So trying to get this into where it's actually deployable is also ongoing. And then there's some patches that showed up on the Linux wireless. I think it's up to iteration 6 or something now, which tries to cut down on multicast by just in the AP, we just, instead of sending out a multicast packet, we just duplicate it to unicast it to every station. And if you have higher rates, then you can actually gain a lot by this, and you don't wake up stations and so on. So this is also ongoing. And as I said, there's lots of people working on this. It's sort of flying in loose formation towards the future, and we're trying to get as much as possible to go upstream. And of course, LEAD is the bleeding edge of a lot of this, and it's one of the main test platforms that we use when we develop this. So, questions? Yes?
Do I understand correctly that this is actually the station tracker, meaning that the schedule is when it's going to transmit packets, so that will apply to each of the individual stations and to the access point for traffic before it's sent on wires. It's not actually implemented in the RTS-CTS algorithm of the access point itself.
Yeah, no. No, we don't touch the PDF function. Like, we don't touch the back-off. We don't touch anything in how the stations grab the air. So they will still compete with each other. The app access point will still compete with the stations like they have always. So the airtime scheduler only modifies in which order is the access point going to send to different stations. And this was, and it turns out you can actually do quite a lot just by doing this. But one of the things that we've been talking about is what happens with QoS, for example. You can use the different QoS parameters to get different RTS, CTS with different back-off behavior for different cases. And we don't do that right now. So this is only a scheduler that only divides out the stations. But one of the interesting things we saw here was we compared VoIP traffic before and after these modifications, and we tried to compute everyone's favorite MOS value. And we compared with what happens if you send it with VO marked, so it goes into the QoS VO queue, and what happens if you just send it as best effort. And what we saw was with these queuing modifications, we actually get the latency down so that the computed MOS value now is better than it was if you send it on the VO queue before. So now we actually get better performance on best effort traffic than we did with the VO traffic before. And that means that you don't actually, if you don't control your marking of your packets, you can still get really low latency and nice behavior with the best effort traffic.
That was going to be my next question.
Yes. Anyone else? No? Yep, thank you.